Hi, everybody. So we're the entertainment after lunch. So welcome. I don't know how to tap dance, but I'm certainly going to try right now. I'm Jess Byrne. I'm a principal analyst on the security and risk team at Forrester Research. And one of the areas that I cover is incident response and crisis management. I also cover email messaging and collaboration security. And I've been working with Forrester CISO clients for, gosh, the better part of 13, 14 years now, starting as an advisor on our security and risk council. So I write for the role of the CISO along with Jeff, with a particular focus on security talent management, hiring, training, and retention of security staff. Jeff, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, so Jeff Pollard here. I'm a vice president and principal analyst on the security and risk team at Forrester. Cover a lot of different topics, but the one kind of most germane for this conversation is that I lead our research on managed detection and response. So Jess and I collaborate pretty often in that context along with CISO stuff. For my background, I've been at places like Mandiant, Dell SecureWorks, FireEye, other places. I've been at Forrester now for about 10 years, where I lead our topic related to global security services. And so that's the context of why I'm up here talking to you. So we'll start here. Jess and I realized that our talk is not incredibly technical. There's a good reason for that. We promise it's worth it. But we didn't want to be the only talk that didn't have screenshots of tools.
Right.
So we put this here so we wouldn't be the only talk without a demo or the only talk without a screenshot of tools. So if you came for this, slide one, we accomplished it. You're welcome. This is it though. So if you're looking for more tool stuff, this is all we're going to show you. Now we've got plenty of cool diagrams, we've got timelines, we've got processes, we've got checklists, we've got the whole thing. We have RACI charts, all that stuff. Everything you ever want to watch after lunch is absolutely in this talk, right? Everyone wants to see a RACI right after lunch. But as far as tools go, this is it.
Right.
I'll hand it.
Okay, so why are we here? I mean, personally, I was kind of here for the Pioneer Day parade this morning. Got to check out some of those floats, and they were pretty fantastic. But we are here, and it was mentioned in our intro that MDR to IR handoffs are a bit of a problem. We've done a lot of research in this space, and it really became a catalyst for us to write a report about this and even to submit this talk when we started doing our customer reference interviews for our respective wave evaluations that Forrester does. So Jeff for MDR, myself for IR services. And we found that there are a number of issues with the handoff, and they can all be distilled down to these 7. And I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because they actually sort of have a cascading effect. But the first one I think is really important. And we're going to talk a lot about that in the beginning of this talk today, and that is escalation. So if there are issues with defining the severity of a breach, defining the scope of a breach, you're wasting time and potentially running afoul of regulatory requirements that have very, very tight timelines for breach notification. You could be running afoul of client requirements. You could be setting yourself up for poor standing with your cybersecurity, your cyber insurance company. Then there's documentation gaps. And Jessica did a great job earlier today talking about the fact that playbooks don't get updated as often as they should. And that leads to confusion. That leads to protocol confusion. That leads to wasted time once again. And again, all of these cascade, leading to response delays, giving the attackers that critical window to put in backdoors, remain persistent in your environment. And then finally, with the skill misalignment, if you have folks from your MDR provider or your internal teams that are really much more well-versed in detection and maybe incident management, they may not be the right folks that should be working that incident when it comes to payment, eradication, and overall response. So really, again, this comes down to big process gaps, big communication gaps, and a ton of wasted, precious time. Now, I heard from security leaders, we both heard from security leaders, they felt they were spending far too much time translating between MDR and IR and being the person that's actually doing that work rather than managing up, working with the C-level executives, working with the board, and maybe talking to very critical customers about the incident that's happening. IR providers also said they were wasting time not getting the information that they needed, not getting the access that they needed in a timely manner. And then the folks on the MDR side sometimes felt like they were just sitting around wondering what it is they should or should not be doing during an incident. So all of this can be solved with a focus on process. So great. I just identified the problem. I feel like a security platform vendor with my deck here, but what do we do to actually fix this? And I want to actually illustrate this with a data point from Forrester's 2025 security survey. And when we fielded this survey. We asked C-level executives with security decision-making power, what did they do? And these folks all reported one or more breaches in the past 12 months. What did they invest in? What did they do in response to those breaches? And you can see that tech really does rise to the top there. We've got investing in tech for protection, detection, response, recovery, log retention, log aggregation, and then a little bit further down are the process pieces, right? Security, upskilling, maybe revamping protocols and processes for incident response and crisis management. So I think sometimes when people think about what to do in response to a breach, process is something that they think of as a given, and it's not. It shouldn't be taking a backseat to tech. So I have this little timeline here. It's pretty crude. And we're going to talk about the steps that it takes to actually have a smooth MDR to IR handoff. And then again, an IR back to MDR handoff, because we did identify that as a problem as well. So I'm not going to go into specifics. This isn't a tabletop exercise, but let's just say the MDR provider gets an alert. They realize this is something that's beyond just regular incident management. They're going to escalate it up to the internal folks in your organizations. Maybe that's yourselves, realizing then that this could have a bigger impact. This is where that escalation scope, incident scope and severity comes into play, and having the right documentation of all of that becomes really, really important. So this is where you have to get consistent. And I've seen this in not enough incident response plans, and I actually have reviewed a good number of them for Forrester clients, and I don't see something like this. Every once in a while, I'll see something that's gold. And recently, in a research interview that we did for one of the folks that is going to participate in our report, I saw this beautiful severity matrix. And that actually had solid, formalized, well-socialized definitions for incident severity. Now, I've looked at several of these, and it really comes down to, I'm not going to go through all these. You basically know what this is, but a lot of times this isn't actually included in the incident response plan. So when you're talking about a high or critical severity incident, this is again where materiality comes in. And this is part of materiality assessment. And so you're going to need to make sure that you have all the information you need for all the stakeholders that are going to be involved in declaring a material breach to have that information at their fingertips, because they're going to be looking at you, they're going to be looking at the security leader. And to figure out what constitutes a high or a critical incident severity, you have to think about the scope. And I won't go through all of these, but things like scale, how many systems, how many users, how many locations were affected or impacted, what kind of data was lost. Brand and reputation is another one. I thought the Ubiquity story that we heard earlier today was a great one, right? An insider wrecked their brand and reputation, and that actually affected their financial situation. So all of this needs to be created in a beautiful severity matrix so you understand exactly what you're dealing with and what aligns to what in terms of definitions. This also matters, and we'll actually use data as an example here just to do this. And again, we're thinking more about a table, but I wanted to make a prettier rainbow slide for this presentation. But again, data, let's use that as an example. If it's a low severity incident, maybe it's public data, somebody got in, messed around, there's some reports or some filing, there's some marketing materials, nothing that feels like you're gonna have a major impact. Medium, maybe it's some internal, non-confidential data, I don't know, announcements, newsletters, things that might be on a SharePoint site, that might be on an intranet or a portal. High, you're getting into things that are probably issues, internal communications that could affect brand or reputation, financial statements, customer lists that could be stolen, and then obviously critical, confidential data, stuff that is going to run you afoul of regulatory requirements, IP theft, maybe even customer payment data. And again, this is when you're thinking about a material breach. This is also when you need to be bringing in the right stakeholders and the right members of your ecosystem, that being IR services and of course, outside counsel. And stakeholders, again, should be a part of that severity matrix. If you're dealing with a low incident, it probably never gets up the food chain, and that's fine, right? That's basically incident management. But as you get to medium, you're gonna be needing to bring in maybe your boss's boss, right? The CIO, whoever the CISO reports to. And then from there, once you get into that higher critical, you need to be bringing in your outside counsel. You need to be thinking about updating the board. The entire C-level executive team is going to be there. Again, they're going to be looking to you to get the information to them that they need to decide whether this is a material incident and to report it. And again, I can't stress enough, and we heard this on all of our research calls, how important it is to bring in outside counsel. And this is a quote from somebody that we spoke to for part of our research. And when he was talking about this, he said that many times he was very surprised that as an MDR provider, the clients were not excited about invoking IR services. They weren't excited about bringing in lawyers. And again, attorney-client privilege is what it is. I agree that it doesn't actually help us with transparency when we could be learning a lot from incidents as part of the greater community, but it is extremely important for a number of reasons. So I would make sure that all of this comes into play, because even if it's the CEO, chief legal counsel that's going to ultimately declare a breach, all eyes, and I've been in executive tabletop exercises, all eyes are on that security leader. So they need to be there with the right information, with consistent definitions of what an incident is. Going back to our little timeline, now we've gotten all the way up here, it's escalated, outside counsel's been brought in, a breach has been declared, IR services have been invoked, and everything is now blanketed under attorney-client privilege, and this is where I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Yep, absolutely. So now we're going to talk about MDR and what's happening there. So as a quick show of hands, you don't have to name names or mention vendors, but has anyone been involved in an IR where you're handing off from MDR or handing back to MDR? Any experience with that? And we got guesses. Was it a largely positive experience, largely negative experience? What do you think? Okay, I see some so-sos. I see thumbs down, 2 thumbs down, big thumbs down. One of those thumbs down was like super big. It was all
right.
2 thumbs down. This is, I feel like an auctioneer up here. This is amazing. All right. So after the talk, you can let us know how much we got right, how much we got wrong, or anything we need to add. By the way, I'm going to count on all of y'all that said so-so or down. I'll say this first and foremost, right? On an MDR provider side, they're being driven a lot by the client, but they're also protective of what they've done, right? You're not part of the client organization. So that means I may not share everything. Sometimes IR providers are pretty unclear about exactly what they need from the MDR provider. So your checklist to them is, hey, we need to understand time frame of detection, IOCs, IOAs, whatever you want to call it, the affected accounts and identities, actions you've already taken, the actions the customer has taken, all access details and log details about the event, because in the best of scenarios, what the MDR provider is doing, provided they're competent and good, more on that in a few slides, we'll get there, I promise. If they're competent, if they're good, ideally what they're doing is they're allowing you as an IR provider to not just hit the ground running, but actually start the IR before your even boots are on the ground. But we find that just doesn't happen often enough. And that's where the leader steps in and has to be that governance. The way I think about a lot of this, right, is I think there have been a ton of talks today that help you become a better investigator, a better examiner. They've been super inspirational to listen to. When I think about this talk and our conversations with CISOs, I think about this as for those of you that are looking at that next step in your career that want to be the engagement manager, provided you want to, that's not a job. You want to be the person that sits down with the C-levels and makes those decisions about criticality, makes those decisions about how things are going. These are the kinds of things you have to think about, because at an executive level, governance between vendors becomes one of, if not your biggest problem. So that's what this part of the talk is really kind of designed to help you understand. The details matter. And all too often, this is not documented well enough in the organizations we talk to. You need to figure out within your incident response plan, or even within your escalation procedures of your incident response provider and your MDR provider, what is a severity level? I have so many times, y'all, I talk to end user organizations and they say to me, how does this vendor define severity? And that is a totally acceptable question. The question every vendor you work with should be able to answer. But my response to them is, how do you define severity? Because if you don't have a matrix like this that says, this happened this way, it includes this data, or we need this kind of data, we need to think about how we're going to deliver this. Is it going to be via chat? Is it going to be via email? Is it going to be out of band in a scenario where we need out of band comms? If you don't have those things mapped out, even with your MDR provider, then all of that stuff is lost or unavailable when it comes time for IR. So you've got to sit down and think about these sorts of things, right? What is a critical incident? You've got a 0 to 15-minute response window. You need this kind of data. If it's operational, it's maybe 15 minutes to 2 hours. I won't go through each one. You can take a picture, you'll get the deck, but you sort of see what it is. The key here is that this needs to exist somewhere. It needs to be defined. And it needs to be defined between the customer that you might be performing IR for, or the company you work for performing IR, and the MDR provider that's in place. If you don't have it, that's an issue. It's setting you up to be behind the 8 ball when you actually need to bring someone in and put those boots on the ground or initiate formal incident response. So what should MDR do during an incident? This is fun. So first and foremost, one of the things that we all know that people outside this field don't know is that when an incident happens, the business keeps running. There are some incidents that shut down the entirety of the enterprise. So those are true, we read about them, but there's this sort of mythology in the rest of the world that if we have an incident, the business stops. We all know that's not true. The same way that we all know a lot of times in the middle of an incident, there are 4 different consulting firms involved, sometimes 2 or 3 people from the same one that are representing clients you work with, right? So the first thing is MDR needs to do business as usual monitoring because the rest of the enterprise is operating. They're still in business and you still need security oversight, especially in scenarios where the big noisy event actually just cover for the low and slow incident that the adversaries use this. So we still need MDR monitoring, of course. We need containment of associated systems or other incidents, right? MDR should be doing those things, but maybe those tasks are outside the scope of the ongoing incident. So they still need to run their normal processes and procedures, but they need to let the IR provider know that they're doing it. Because what if you discover after some breadcrumbs, after some artifacts, investigative methodologies, turns out those systems are in scope. And then finally, threat hunts. And for those of y'all that are directly in IR that have to deal with MDR, this is a great way to leverage MDR providers. Right? Yes, you can go in and you can do sweeps, you can do hunts, you can do that as part of your investigative methodology. But if you're working on behalf of the client and you're performing other tasks that are just as important and you can offload that to the MDR provider, you absolutely should, provided your client says it's okay. And fortunately, attorneys say it's okay. Different scenario there. In fact, I know one MDR leader, the way that he recruited his entire V1 MDR delivery team is he went to a bunch of IR folks at his company and said, how would you like to do IR without attorneys? They were like, whoa, sign me up. Didn't even mention no travel. Just said without attorneys, and he had enough people to staff his first version of MDR. So it does happen. You still have to loop those in. Then you need to figure out in that plan, what happens and who does it next. The details on this slide aren't that important. They're there, they're for demonstrative purposes. Again, take a picture, you'll get the content. In fact, if what you come up with looks exactly like this, you probably failed. The key is that it needs to exist somewhere. You need to have thought about this. When you do those tabletops with maybe an IR retainer provider, or if you're the retainer provider yourself and you go in, if they have MDR with your company or a different one, you need to sit down and say, hey, let's actually, as part of our tabletop, go through the handoff between MDR and IR. What is IR doing? What is MDR doing? What data is necessary? Who's responsible for what? And what are the key deliverables within that particular set of steps and stages? There are things that could be automated. There's information that can be shared, but you need to have it mapped out. That's the most important takeaway. Again, most folks don't, and then during the incident is the worst possible time to figure out that you have fairly substantial communication gaps between your MDR provider and the folks that are performing your incident response. Don't want to learn about it. We heard several stories about this where there was a debate internally about invoking incident response because they wanted to avoid attorney-client privilege. That took 4 to 6 hours to investigate. Then there's another debate about whether or not they have a retainer because they have to remember that or figure it out. If they need to sign up with someone or call the 1-800 hotline so they can scope out the engagement. Okay, that took 2 to 3 more hours. Then they've got to get something signed. That took an hour because everyone was yelling at the CFO and the CFO signed it and went through procurement, even though that's also the same scenario we hear about when an attack actually happens, is the CFO gets pressured to sign something. That's okay, let's pretend like this is fine. So all that happens, now we're 6 to 8 hours behind on the incident. The MDR provider's just been doing business as usual, like, hey, do you want us to contain the system or not? By the way, they still haven't contained it because nobody told them to yet. So the adversaries got free reign, all the credentials in the world are captured, all the identities are captured. Turns out, great news, IR is gonna take way longer. Bad news, adversaries everywhere, everything's hosed, we gotta rebuild the whole thing. That's real, right? Y'all have probably lived through this. That actually happened. That's the friction when you don't have something like this. So all the timing matters. Right? You might have to deliver logs, the IOCs, the relevant data, but you've still got the ongoing environment monitoring by the MDR provider taking place on the back end. One of the global VPs of forensics incident response at a leading MDR and IR provider, maybe even could be someone's boss in this room, you never know, basically said, here's what we want MDR to do, both ours and someone else's. Continue the normal course of activity within the guidelines that we provide. I want to stress that we probably bold that, but we didn't. That's our fault. You can blame us. The reason why I say we provide is because in this scenario, When it comes to the MDR provider, right, they are a vendor of the customer. But if you are an external IR provider or even internal, you are now taking over dictation of service, which means that as that IR provider, you are the person that's going to interface on behalf of the client to say, this is what MDR needs to do. That's the best thing that can happen. The worst thing they can do is continue to try to run their own investigation. And boy, oh boy, did we hear stories. In fact, some of y'all with the thumbs down probably have some of those and share with us as well. Because there are things that MDR should never do during an incident, and MDR providers will absolutely do this. More on that in just 1 second. One, run mini IR engagements themselves. Oh my goodness, I've seen like 4 head nods in every single row. This is amazing. I'm so happy. Thank you all. 2, wipe systems. I mean, it just kind of goes, I'm not going to, all right, we don't need to expound on that one. I think we all get it. Delete data, sort of like wiping systems, but instead it's just not as noticeable. MDR should never do those things, but something Phil said earlier, not every analyst is created the same, right? Well, not every MDR provider is created the same. So we'll get to that. But when we see bad behavior with those MDR providers that aren't created the same, it's where we see someone who's an IT services provider masquerading as a security company. That's when it goes very, very badly from the outset. So as IR folks, again, internal or external, it doesn't matter. You got to think about the vendors that you work with, the folks on the other side of the table. Now, I really want to name vendor names, who these people are. I'm not, someone will get mad at me. But there are real versus fake MDR. When I write a wave, these are the folks I'm writing about, except I'll tell you, none of those fake MDR vendors make it in my waves. But there are real versus fake MDRs. There are MSSPs that are actively acting as MDR, right? MDR washing. Again, I have impulse control problems. I took my Adderall a few minutes ago, so I'll probably get through this without it. But I really want to say vendor names here. Talk to me after, and I'll definitely, once I figure out if you work for them. But there are a lot of MSSPs that act as MDR providers. And their answer for every problem is take the system offline, wipe it, reload it, and you're good to go. So that's, if you run into that, that's who you got. ITSPs acting as MDR. Well, we do all the patch management. We have a whole bunch of visibility in the system. So we decided to spin up an MDR program. Talked to a guy just hired by a relatively large regional kind of ITSP and was like, they say they have a SOC. I came into the SOC, they have 0 processes documented for how to handle it. He's like, I am literally having to build out process trees for endpoint alert found a bad thing and cleaned it up. They don't know how to handle it, right? There's an example of a regional IT provider in the Northeastern United States with several financial services companies, wink, that did not know how to do even the basic stuff. Bars that are reselling MDR that might tell you who the underlying MDR provider is or may not, so you don't know. Getting a quality MDR service, or are you getting something OEM'd that might be kind of poor? And then you have the actual MDRs of the world. Now look, I'm going to mention names here because these are vendors I've covered. I'm assessed them. Folks like Expel, folks like Red Canoe, right? Folks like ReliaQuest and others. They're not always good at MDR. They're good at some things, but they're good at MDR. Those are the kind of vendors that are doing actual MDR, right? The folks that have the background, that have the bona fides, that know how to conduct it. Those are but there's an important part of this that came up as we were sort of doing the research, which is that it's not just a handoff from MDR to IR. There's a whole other handoff that happens. Because after the incident, it goes back to MDR. And that's a weird transition for an organization to make, because you've had this sort of security blanket on site working through this event with you, and you've got executive exposure, and you're talking to executives, and this is what the co-founder of one MDR provider said, is it's a consistent problem, the wartime versus peacetime mentality in these two worlds. If you've been stuck in wartime for a while and it feels like a long time, even if it was just 2 weeks, right? Because we all know our time during an incident gets distorted, right? Especially for the folks experiencing it, right? The actual victims. And then coming back into peacetime is really uncomfortable because you don't have the engagement manager there anymore. You don't have that person talking to the C-suite on your behalf. The C-suite might kind of stop caring as much about time frame. So it's hard to make that transition back in a meaningful way. And this is where IR providers don't always do the best job. IR pros and IR providers don't always give the kind of information that MDR needs to effectively take this back over. Because what MDR providers need to know about IR and ongoing MDR after the fact is that they need to be read into the incident, is where you can also encounter issues with attorney-client privilege, because the lawyers might say, you can't tell them. To figure out, do NDAs cover this or not? Is that appropriate for privilege or isn't it? We need to know. The biggest thing, and the number one thing on this, again, we should have this bolded, but it's all on the slide, it's fine. The number one thing that you need to give the MDR provider if you want them to help, I don't know if you have to like write this down on a napkin so the attorneys don't know, whatever. Again, don't violate privilege. But The thing that they need to know is items that indicate reentry. Once you leave, if you can give the MDR provider anything, you have to beg, borrow, steal, negotiate with the attorneys, never show weakness, then this is the number one thing, items that indicate reentry. Try to give the MDR provider that, because if that's seen, it's obvious why. That's what they need to know. And then finally, is there a deeper relationship handoff that you can have within IR to MDR to be more involved in the ongoing delivery of that service in the future now that you've worked together? Can you sit down and audit the existing processes and handoffs to improve them such that things are actually better now, right? So don't just think about it as like the incident's over, we've done all we can. Don't even think about it as the post-incident handoff, the after action item, review, whatever it might be. Don't think about it like that. Think about how can we optimize service delivery as a result. That's really, really important. And then for the most exciting part of the entire talk, especially after lunch, the RACI, which I'm going to give Jess to go through.
I love a good race.
There you go.
So this was one, basically, this is not at all exhaustive. Once again, as Jeff said, if you're going to use this, like you need to customize this for your own organization. And this really just covers what we talked about today. And I would probably add another accountable in there that I missed before we handed in these slides. But it's really important, again, in your IR plan, not only to have that severity matrix, but to have a RACI chart, also updated context, bring that over and over again. People just don't update these along with the playbooks, as Jessica mentioned earlier, making sure that you know who is ultimately accountable for what. And you'll see the security leader, right? The team is ultimately accountable for a lot of these steps, but they had been spending too much time actually. So understanding who is giving the information to whom, underprivileged or not, is incredibly important. When IR services are invoked, they really do need to start being the folks that are responsible for a lot of those actions. So I'm going to wrap it up with this, and it looks like we might have time for questions. Great. But as Jeff mentioned earlier, I think a lot of folks are, not using MDR to the best of their abilities during an incident. Those threat hunts, the just business as usual, ongoing monitoring, maybe be able to tie in other indicators to the larger incident, put them to use. They may not be privy to all the information that your team is, that the IR provider is, because of that attorney-client privilege, but make sure that you're putting sure that they're actually helping out, and also make sure that they're not doing something that they shouldn't be. And then this is one that always surprises me, because I talk to a lot of folks. I do a wave on incident response services. I get calls and asked, who should I put on my short list? And I will ask, well, who are you using now? Well, so-and-so. Well, are you onboarded with them? What do you think of their, incident readiness services? Oh, we just have a retainer. We haven't really used them. We haven't really done anything with them. And it blows my mind. I mean, I talked to a large municipality a year or so ago who said, oh yeah, we've got hundreds, we've got hours and hours and hours in our retainer, and it's about to expire. One, that's bad on the IR provider. They should be providing customer success folks that are actually helping them use those retainer hours up. But not being fully onboarded, it means all of those delays are going to be exacerbated, right? Contracts are not going to be signed. Maybe you're actually looking on a website for an 800 number rather than having your actual contact person ready to go. And then, of course, you can do all the tabletop exercises that you'd like, but if you're not including every party that's going to be involved in the incident in those exercises, be they tabletops or crisis simulations, then you're going to have those process gaps, those communication gaps, and that wasted precious time again. So if you're going to do this, practice, practice, practice with the people who are going to be involved to avoid all of these missteps that we've heard so much about from our clients and from providers. Anything you want to say in closing here?
No, I think we covered it. I'm anxious for questions.
All right. Thank you all very much.